For decades, the Judds were seen as country music's perfect duo, but it turns out that behind the glitz and glamour, something extremely heartbreaking was happening. There were things the public never saw, deeply personal struggles, health battles, and family problems that they tried so hard to hide from the world. Why did Naomi Judd suddenly walk away from the spotlight, just as the Judds were peaking? What was the real story behind the tears, the silence, and the long stretches of distance between mother and daughter? Now, at 60, Wynonna Judd is finally talking, and what she just revealed is not what anyone expected. The formation of the Judds. The complicated history of the Judds begins with one woman, Naomi Judd, whose life set the foundation for what would later become one of the most iconic country music bands. But most people don't realize that Naomi didn't set out to become a country music star initially. In fact, her early years looked nothing like the life of a future Grammy winner. Born Diana Ellen Judd in Ashland, Kentucky in 1946, Naomi lived a modest life rooted in Southern values, and her path was anything but smooth. By the time she was in her early 20s, she had already endured more than most people could. She became a teenage mother at just 18 years old, after giving birth to Christina Claire Simonella, whom the world would later know as Wynonna Judd. And to make matters worse, Wynonna's father abandoned her shortly after. Naomi was forced to raise her daughter alone, navigating welfare lines, working double shifts as a waitress, and later going to nursing school, all while trying to keep her young daughter grounded. Just a few years later, Naomi welcomed a second daughter, Ashley Judd, and by then, the family situation was nothing short of chaotic. They moved frequently, often living in modest or run-down homes, sometimes without a working telephone. At one point, they lived in a mountain home without television, electricity, or even indoor plumbing. But it was in these quiet, stripped-down moments that Naomi and Wynonna discovered their shared love of music. Wynonna, whose stage name came from the town of Winona, Arizona, had shown signs of musical talent from an early age. Naomi, though exhausted and financially strained, nurtured that spark. She exposed her daughter to the sounds of classic country stars like Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, and Emmylou Harris, and made sure that music, no matter how hard life got, was always playing in the background. But their connection wasn't just mother and daughter. It was something more. There was an almost unspoken musical chemistry between them. Naomi's harmonies wrapped around Wynonna's powerful lead vocals like a second skin. It wasn't trained or polished, it came to them naturally. By the late 1970s, Naomi had moved the family to Nashville in search of better opportunities. She was working as a nurse at the time and happened to treat a patient whose father worked in the music industry. She boldly handed over a demo tape of just her and Wynonna singing with a simple acoustic guitar, and that moment would change their lives forever. In 1983, RCA Records signed the duo, and they became known simply as the Judds. This move became a breakthrough not just for them, but for country music in general. At the time, the genre was dominated by male voices and traditional themes, and so the Judds brought something different to the game. They were a mother-daughter duo singing about love, heartache, faith, and family with an authenticity that was impossible to fake, and they immediately stood out. Their first major hit, Mama He's Crazy, hit #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart in 1984 and won them a Grammy for Best Country Performance by a duo or group with vocal. That same year, they were named the Top Vocal Duo of the Year by the Academy of Country Music. Their debut EP had only 6 songs, but it was enough to ignite the fire. From there, the hits just kept coming. Each song was layered with vulnerability and strength that echoed the same qualities Naomi had passed on to Wynonna as a child. But what set the Judds apart wasn't just their sound, it was their story. Country fans could relate to the single mom scraping by and to the young girl with a big voice and a bigger dream, and this made them feel real. Between 1984 and 1991, the Judds won 5 Grammy Awards, 9 Country Music Association awards, and 14 Billboard #1 hits. They sold more than 20 million albums and became one of the most successful duos in country music history. During that golden era, the Judds redefined what a country act could be. They were women in control of their sound, women telling their own stories, and women unafraid to wear their emotions on their sleeves. In many ways, their bond was their brand. Their music became the soundtrack to people's weddings, funerals, Sunday drives, heartbreaks, and homecomings. But fame, as we know, is never simple. And for the Judds, it came at a cost. While they stood on stages across America, smiling in matching outfits, collecting awards with grace, behind the scenes, Naomi Judd was fighting battles the world didn't know about. Naomi Judd's private battles. For years, Naomi Judd stood on stage, her voice blending effortlessly with Wynonna's in sold-out arenas. And this made it easy for the world to believe that their life behind the scenes was just as polished. But that was far from the truth. Naomi Judd was battling something far more complicated than fame or the music business. She was fighting for her health, her sanity, and sometimes just the strength to make it through the day. Not long after the Judds reached the peak of their fame, Naomi received news that shattered the foundation she had worked so hard to build. She was diagnosed with hepatitis C, a chronic and potentially life-threatening liver disease. Naomi didn't contract it through reckless living or substance abuse, like so many in the public wrongly assumed. In fact, it came from her years of service as a registered nurse, a job she had taken back when music was still just a dream. She had been exposed to contaminated blood while treating patients, never knowing that a moment of compassion on the job would come back years later as a silent intruder. The diagnosis didn't just mark the beginning of a health crisis, it marked the end of the Judds' golden era. The treatment for hepatitis C in the early 1990s was notoriously brutal. Naomi had to endure interferon therapy, which came with a long list of side effects that stripped away her energy, dulled her sharp mind, and plunged her into a fog of fatigue, confusion, and hopelessness. She was once the radiant frontwoman whose voice filled stadiums, but the side effects of this disease left her with days where she couldn't even get out of bed, watching herself deteriorate, knowing the world still saw her as a star, while inside she felt like a shadow of who she used to be. The medication reportedly caused some memory loss, something especially painful for a woman who had always prided herself on her sharp wit and charm. But the most difficult part of the journey wasn't just physical. It was emotional. As her health declined, so did her sense of identity. Without music and the constant motion of touring, Naomi was suddenly still, and in that stillness, old traumas began to resurface. The childhood wounds, the struggles of single motherhood, the loss, the abandonment, and the years of pushing forward without stopping to process anything all caught up to her. What followed was a long and painful struggle with severe depression, something she kept hidden from the public for as long as she could. Naomi spoke later in life about what it was like to sit in the quiet of her Tennessee farmhouse and feel completely lost. Her mind would spiral. Eventually, Naomi sought psychiatric treatment. She checked herself into inpatient care more than once, trying everything from medication to talk therapy to experimental treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, just to silence the emotional noise that had grown louder than any audience ever had. Her journey with mental health was long, complicated, and often misunderstood. Even those closest to her sometimes struggled to grasp the depth of her pain. Her 2 daughters, Wynonna and Ashley, each had their own reactions to their mother's unraveling. Wynonna, her singing partner and closest collaborator, found herself drifting in and out of closeness with Naomi. Their relationship had always been intense, passionate, and loving, but also full of friction. Naomi had poured everything into Wynonna's success, but sometimes that energy turned into control, and Wynonna, as she grew older, struggled to define her own identity outside of their duo, and this led to frequent tension and fights between the 2 women. Ashley, Naomi's younger daughter, who went on to become a celebrated actress, had her own challenges with Naomi. In interviews, Ashley has talked about growing up in a home that felt unpredictable, even unsafe at times. The love was there, but so was chaos. Naomi's mental health battles didn't just affect her, they rippled outward, touching everyone in the family. There were times when all three women weren't speaking. There were holidays spent apart, arguments that escalated, and old wounds that reopened. And yet, there were also tender moments with reunions, hugs, apologies, and an unspoken understanding that their story, as messy as it was, would always be defined by love. But as Naomi fought these private battles behind closed doors, it began to take a toll on her professional career. And the world kept asking, where are the Judds? Why had the music stopped? And was this the end of one of country music's most beloved duos? The end of the Judds. On December 4, 1991, fans all over the world were left heartbroken when Naomi Judd walked on stage in Tennessee for what was billed as the Judds' farewell tour. She wore a bright smile, and Wynonna stood beside her like always. But this time, every note carried a finality, because Naomi was saying goodbye, not just to the music, but to the beautiful career she had built with her daughter. Her diagnosis of hepatitis C had made the decision for her. It was no longer possible for Naomi's body to keep up with the fast pace of touring, performing, and the exhausting schedule. In fact, her doctors made it clear that if she didn't stop, she may not live long enough to watch her daughters grow older. It was the kind of decision no performer ever wants to face, especially one at the very top. At the time, the Judds had numerous top 10 hits, 5 Grammys, and a legacy most artists only dreamed about. But Naomi had to step away from it all with a painful sense of resolve. As the curtain closed on the Judds, the world turned its eyes to Wynonna. Everyone wanted to know if she could stand on her own, and if the voice that had once harmonized with her mother could carry the weight of an entire solo career. Wynonna launched her solo journey in 1992. Her first album was a smash hit, debuting at #1 on the Billboard country charts. But even with the success, Wynonna later admitted how deeply she struggled to find herself. For so long, she had been one half of a duo, always Naomi's daughter and always part of the Judds. Now she was just Wynonna, and for a while, she didn't know what that meant. She wrestled with expectations, with the spotlight, and with the legacy her mother left behind. People constantly compared her to her mother, and deep down, she was still trying to process the sudden goodbye and the loneliness of a solo stage. Naomi, on the other hand, wasn't done living, and with the end of the Judds, she found a new sense of purpose. She became an advocate, not just for her own healing, but for others. She used her voice to raise awareness about hepatitis C, traveling, speaking, educating, and doing everything she could to help people understand a disease that was still deeply misunderstood. But that's not all, because later she did the same with mental health. Naomi was open about her journey with depression and anxiety, not to gain sympathy, but to spark change. She wanted people to talk about what hurt and to know they weren't alone. And every now and then, just when fans thought it was truly over, the Judds reunited, if only for a song or two. There was the emotional performance at the 1994 Super Bowl, where they delivered "Love Can Build a Bridge" with harmonies that hadn't aged a day. There was a reunion tour in 2000, another in 2010, and scattered appearances here and there that reminded the world why they had fallen in love with the Judds in the first place. But the truth was, behind the scenes, the reunions were often brief because the pain, both physical and emotional, never truly left them. Naomi's health and the emotional tug-of-war between mother and daughter, though softened by time, still shaped their every interaction. They loved each other fiercely, but they also triggered each other deeply, and that was their painful reality. But while Naomi had stepped away from music, the spotlight never truly stepped away from her, and as time passed, the silence surrounding her private struggles began to grow louder, till it could no longer be ignored. Naomi Judd's tragic passing. On April 30th, 2022, just one day before she was set to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, alongside Wynonna, Naomi Judd passed away at the age of 76. The news wasn't just devastating, it was paralyzing, and it came without warning. What made her death more heartbreaking was how sudden and deeply disorienting it was. For the fans who had followed her story for decades, and for those who had seen her laughing on stage not long before, the announcement felt almost unreal. The family's publicist released a statement immediately that read, "Today, we sisters experienced a tragedy. We lost our beautiful mother to the disease of mental illness. We are shattered. We are navigating profound grief and know that as we loved her, she was loved by her public. We are in unknown territory." The confirmation of how she had lost the lifelong battle against mental illness sent shockwaves through the country music world and far beyond. The news quickly took over headlines, not because of gossip, but because of how deeply Naomi had touched people. She wasn't just a performer, she had become a symbol of survival, resilience, and second chances. She had faced down hepatitis C, spoken openly about her depression, and turned private suffering into public advocacy. That someone so strong could still be vulnerable reminded people of how complex and fragile the human experience really is. And yet, while the world was reeling, Wynonna and Ashley Judd were left to face a moment no daughter should ever have to endure. Because just one day after their mother was gone, they had to stand in front of the world, grief-stricken. The Country Music Hall of Fame induction ceremony, which took place the day after Naomi passed, became something else entirely. What was meant to be a triumphant celebration of the Judds' legacy transformed into an unscripted memorial. Wynonna stood beside Ashley on stage, their faces carrying the kind of grief that can't be rehearsed. While sobbing, Ashley said to the audience, "I'm sorry that she couldn't hang on until today." Then Wynonna spoke about how deeply saddened she was by her mother's passing. However, she said, "It's a strange dynamic to be this broken and this blessed. But though my heart is broken, I will continue to sing." Naomi's passing didn't just end a life, it reopened old wounds. For Wynonna, it stirred decades of complicated emotions, from love to resentment, admiration, confusion, and guilt. Ashley, too, struggled with the weight of the moment. She had always tried to protect her mother, to help her navigate the cycles of depression and recovery. However, now, she was left holding the pain of it all. The days that followed were a blur of tributes, candlelight vigils, and quiet interviews. The Judd family released more details gently, explaining Naomi's long, private battle with mental illness. And across the country, fans responded not with judgment, but with grace. Letters poured in. Flowers were left outside the Country Music Hall of Fame. People opened up about their own battles and their own lost loved ones. Naomi's story, even in her passing, had sparked another wave of truth-telling and a reminder that behind every smile, there may be a silence no one else can hear. But for Wynonna, the silence after her mother's death was not just emotional, it was physical. Rooms were quieter, and stages felt colder. And for the first time in her life, the woman who once sang about love and healing had to figure out how to keep singing without the one person who had always stood beside her. Wynonna Judd's personal struggles. In the months that followed Naomi Judd's passing, Wynonna found herself battling with intense grief. She had dealt with sadness before, but losing her mother in such a sudden, emotionally complex way brought forward a different kind of sorrow and grief. Wynonna was no stranger to mental health struggles. Even before Naomi's passing, she had openly spoken about her lifelong battle with depression and anxiety too. She once described herself as someone who had lived on the edge emotionally for most of her adult life. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed, days when she couldn't remember what hope felt like, and then there were days when the music pulled her through. However, after Naomi died, those lifelines started to blur. In addition to that, Wynonna and her sister Ashley shared a strained and often misunderstood relationship. Wynonna and Ashley had always been different. Wynonna was the performer who lived her life out loud, while Ashley was the actress and activist who found power in control and privacy. They loved their mother in equally fierce but completely different ways. After Naomi's death, those differences deepened the space between them. In an interview, Wynonna once confessed that she and her sister are not as close as she wished they were. She said, "Ashley's doing well. I don't see her very much, and we're not as close as I'd like to be, but that's because success took us away from each other." It's a funny thing. There's a bit of sadness, because being famous takes you from home. She also admitted to struggling with some deep insecurities and vulnerabilities, especially when it comes to relationships with her family. She once said, "I've struggled for years with performer's anxiety and have worked hard to accept myself personally. When I'm dealing with the music, I'm very comfortable and I know what I want. When I'm off by myself in the woods, I look up and go, God, am I okay as a mother and am I a good daughter and sister?" And yet, amid the challenges, Wynonna made a choice to keep performing. Just weeks after burying her mother, she announced that she would go forward with the Judds' final tour, a series of shows that had originally been planned as a reunion between mother and daughter. But now, it would be a tour in tribute, an act of defiance against despair, and a way to transform grief into movement. Some questioned the decision, wondering how she could walk on stage so soon after such a loss. But Wynonna knew something the world didn't. She knew that stopping would be surrender, and that silence wouldn't bring peace. It would worsen her grief. And so she continued singing, not just for the fans or for Mother, but for herself. Each night of the tour was deeply emotional. She sang their biggest hits with guest performers who came to support her. But most importantly, she let herself feel. Wynonna later described the experience as emotionally intense, and even admitted that she almost fainted on stage during some performances due to the overwhelming grief. The entire tour turned into more than just a farewell. It became a form of healing, a celebration of Naomi's influence, a place where fans could mourn, remember, and rejoice all at once. Wynonna said many times that her mother would have wanted the music to go on, and in that belief, she found purpose and a way forward. Despite the grief and the challenges, Wynonna found a way through it all. And just recently, in an extremely deep and personal documentary, Wynonna has opened up about what it was truly like to be in the Judds, how her mother was behind the scenes, and the reality of their lives that most people don't know about. Wynonna's reflections on the Judds. In the 2023 documentary, The Judds, Love is Alive, the final concert, and the recent follow-up, The Judds, Truth Be Told, Wynonna opened up with honesty about her relationship with her mother, Naomi Judd, and how things truly were in the band. The two were praised as one of the most successful mother-daughter duos in country music history. But most people never realized that their private bond was often difficult, complicated, and deeply emotional. Wynonna described their relationship as extremely close, very complicated, and fiercely loving. And in one of the most talked about lines from the series, she said, "I've loved her more than I've loved myself, but Mother was both in love with me and terrified of me, because I represented what she didn't know and couldn't control." Wynonna confessed that although Naomi was deeply connected to her, she was also afraid of her strength and independence. As Wynonna became more outspoken and confident, Naomi struggled to adjust because she was used to being the leader. And so when Wynonna began to grow into her own identity, it created tension that never completely healed. The documentary also revealed that much of the dysfunction in the Judd family stemmed from the trauma Naomi experienced in her childhood. Wynonna and Ashley both opened up about this deeply personal part of their life, with Ashley in particular explaining how their mother had survived unfair treatment as a child and dealt with abandonment from her own parents. That emotional pain followed her into adulthood and motherhood, and eventually began to rub off on the entire family. Wynonna even said, "One of the reasons I have decided that Mom left this world is because of trauma, generational trauma, family stuff that never got healed or fixed. After Naomi's death, Wynonna said the grief wasn't just about losing her mother. It was also about losing the chance to keep working on their relationship. They had started to reconnect in the last few years of Naomi's life, especially during their 2022 farewell tour plans. But when Naomi died, just one day before their Hall of Fame induction, Wynonna said everything was left unfinished. Even after Naomi's passing, Wynonna said she felt her presence everywhere, especially on stage, and that's part of why she chose not to cancel the farewell tour. Instead, she turned it into a tribute, continuing the shows with the help of friends like Brandi Carlile, Martina McBride, and Faith Hill. Her decision to keep performing wasn't easy, especially because she was grieving, angry, and confused. But she also felt a duty, not just to the fans, but to herself, to honor Naomi by doing the thing they built together. And in doing so, she said, she started to find healing. At the same time, Wynonna has admitted that she's also become fiercely protective of her own identity. She understands now, more than ever, that while the Judds was a once-in-a-generation musical force, it was not the full picture of who she is. She is proud of what they built. She's grateful for the legacy, the history, and the place they earned in country music. But she also knows the cost of living only in the past. Wynonna has made it clear that she is not just the daughter in the Judds. She is an artist in her own right, and her voice deserves to be heard not only in memory of what was, but in celebration of what's still to come. In recent years, she has spoken openly about her desire to continue evolving musically. She wants to experiment, collaborate, push boundaries, and explore new sounds. There's a heaviness that comes with being part of a legacy. Because for Wynonna, it's not just about the music, it's about the emotional history behind the songs. And that kind of weight can be both empowering and crushing. She once admitted that there were nights she wasn't sure if she could continue carrying the grief, expectation, and the memory of a woman who was both her greatest champion and her most complex relationship. But she carries it anyway, not because she has to, but because she chooses to. And in that choice, Wynonna has begun to write her own chapter that honors where she came from without letting it define where she's going. The Judds will always be a part of her, but her voice, her soul, and her story are still unfolding. What's your favorite song from the Judds? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.